In 1853, when the prairie winds ran thin and the skies over Kansas hung low and tired, the Bellroot family arrived in Marrowfield. No one knew much about them, only that they came from far east, following wagon trails that few dared take, with a wagon piled too high with things no family needed. The wagon wheels groaned as they crossed the main road, their horses pale and sharp-boned, eyes milky as if they'd been born blind. The Bellroots did not greet anyone. Alvara, the matriarch, sat stiffly in the seat, gloved hands clasped in her lap. Beside her, Tomlin Bellroot guided the horses with a slow, deliberate touch, as though they knew the road better than he did. The children, two pale, narrow-faced girls and a taller boy with eyes like river stones, sat in the back among their trunks and crates. One trunk rattled with each bump in the road, though it was tightly chained. Another, wrapped in oilcloth, dripped faintly onto the boards beneath. They settled on the edge of town, on land the locals called Hollow Bend. It was an old property, a patch of soil where nothing grew right, where the wind turned in circles and the ground seemed soft even in drought. Most families who'd tried to farm it left within a year. But the Bellroots seemed almost pleased with the place. Their house rose fast, too fast for the work to make sense. One day there was only an empty field. The next, a squat, dark structure hunched against the sky, its roofline uneven, its windows too tall and narrow. No carpenter in Marrowfield admitted to building it. From the start, the family kept to themselves. When they did appear in town, they moved with an unsettling quiet, their eyes sliding past people as though they were already looking somewhere else. They bought supplies no one else wanted. Animal bones, dead crows, rusted hinges, fabric stained with something darker than dirt. At night, faint lights flickered at Hollow Bend, sometimes inside the house, sometimes out in the fields. Voices, low, murmuring, not in any known language, carried across the windless dark. Dogs refused to approach the property. Children dared each other to run up to the fence, but none ever touched it. And always the Bellroot children watched. From behind curtains, from the edges of the field, from the shadows near the well in town. They did not blink often, and when they did, it seemed almost forced, as if it were a habit they were trying to remember. By autumn, Marrowfield had begun to feel smaller. The roads seemed to bend subtly toward Hollow Bend. The air felt heavier near the property. And some folks, late at night, thought they heard something beneath the ground. Not movement exactly, but a slow, patient breathing. The Bellroots had arrived. And already, something in Marrowfield had shifted. Started small, as all such things do. A farmer's well water ran red for 3 days before clearing on its own. A line of hogs was found dead in their pen, bodies intact but eyes missing. A widow swore she heard a child calling her name from the rafters, though her attic was empty. The Bellroots never came to church. On Sundays, townsfolk walking past Hollow Bend would see the children in the yard, their feet bare in the frost, tracing shapes into the soil with sticks dipped in something dark. Alvara stood at the porch, watching with an expression too still to be human. The twins, identical in every feature except the direction their hair curled, developed a habit of appearing behind people without making a sound. A schoolteacher found one in her classroom after hours, standing perfectly still between the desks. When asked what she was doing, the girl only whispered, "Listening for the rest of you." Whispers spread. Folks spoke of seeing candlelight in the Bellroots' windows at hours no one should be awake. The sheriff, uneasy but bound by duty, paid a visit and returned pale, refusing to discuss what he'd found. The animals were the first to know. Horses would shy violently when led past Hollow Bend. Dogs howled through the night, facing the Bellroot property with their hackles raised. Even the crows avoided the place, wheeling wide circles around it. One evening, a young boy named Eli wandered too close to their fence. He returned an hour later, clothes soaked through as if he'd fallen in a river, though there was no water nearby. When asked where he'd been, Eli said he had been in the long room, and would say no more. That winter, Reverend Wilkes reported a strange sound while walking home from evening service. A thin, high humming that seemed to come from beneath the frozen ground. Following it led him to the edge of Hollow Bend, where he saw a faint glow deep in the soil. By the time he blinked, it was gone. Fear began to settle in the marrow of the town. People locked their doors earlier, kept their children closer, spoke in lowered voices even in daylight. And still the Bellroots watched, unblinking, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. The land itself seemed to lean toward them, and the omens had only just begun. It rolled in one night without warning, thick, heavy fog that swallowed the streets whole. Lamps barely cut through it, and sound seemed to muffle within its folds. The fog didn't burn off with the sun. It clung low, moving as if it had weight. By the third day, 2 children had gone missing. Both had last been seen walking home from the schoolhouse, swallowed by the mist before their parents' eyes. Searches turned up nothing. Not even footprints remained. Small dolls began appearing on porches, crude, made of sticks and scraps of cloth, each with a smear of something dark across its face. No one claimed them, yet every family who found one reported hearing soft knocking on their windows at night. Reverend Wilkes, shaken but determined, organized a prayer walk through the town. Halfway through, the group passed Hollow Bend. There, in the fog, Wilkes swore he saw a figure standing in the Bellroot yard. A child taller than the others, its face pale and featureless. He approached, but the figure stepped backward and seemed to melt into the fog. When Wilkes reached the spot, the ground was damp and warm to the touch, as though something had just been there. The fog never lifted. It became part of life in Marrowfield, reshaping the town into a place where distances felt longer, where corners hid too much, where you could hear footsteps pacing behind you even on an empty street. And more children vanished, always without a trace. Came in early December without warning. One morning the townsfolk woke to find a thin layer of black snow on the ground. At first they thought it was soot from some far-off fire, but it fell from the sky in slow, spiraling flakes. Each one left a faint stain where it landed, as if it were made of ash soaked in ink. Children were kept indoors. Animals refused to leave their shelters. The snow clung to clothing and skin, leaving a faint, bitter smell that wouldn't wash away. And yet, at Hollow Bend, the Bellroots walked freely through it. The twins played in the yard, bare hands catching the flakes and pressing them to their lips. Travelers who came through Marrowfield during the black snow did not make it far. Their wagons or horses were found days later on the outskirts, abandoned, the traces of their owners vanishing into the stained drifts. The sheriff stopped sending search parties. Frost began to crawl across windows in strange patterns, delicate spirals and symbols that no one recognized, always facing Hollow Bend. Some swore they could see tiny moving shapes within the frost, like insects frozen mid-flight. Others claimed the frost spelled out words in a language that hurt to read. When questioned, Alvara Bellroot only smiled faintly and said, "Winter always shows the truth. The black snow stayed for weeks. It did not melt in the sun. It did not shift with the wind. And when it finally disappeared, it did so all at once, vanishing overnight as though someone had swept it away. But the frost marks on windows remained. Spring should have come. The snow should have melted. The ground softened. The trees begun to bud. But in Marrowfield, nothing changed. The soil stayed frozen solid. The grass lay brittle and gray. Even the river seemed slower, as if something beneath it were holding the water back. Gardens failed before they began. Seeds rotted in the dirt. The Bellroot twins were seen painting the trunks of dead trees with something thick and dark. When a man approached to stop them, he claimed the paint was warm to the touch, and that the symbols shifted when he looked away. He did not speak to anyone for 3 days afterward. A strange erosion began, not of the land but of the people. Names slipped from memory. Faces felt harder to recall. Conversations trailed off into silence as if the thought had simply evaporated. Some residents woke to find their own belongings unrecognizable. A chair in the corner that had always been there now seemed foreign, its wood unfamiliar. A photograph on the wall bore people they could not name. Those who tried to leave town often returned without realizing they'd gone, swearing they had been away for hours when they'd only walked to the edge of Hollow Bend's fields. And through it all, the Bellroots thrived. The trees they painted began to sprout leaves. though not green ones but pale, almost translucent fronds that moved without wind. The thaw never came. The first sighting came from a schoolboy who claimed to have seen the other one in the Bellroot yard. A child taller than the twins but shorter than the boy, with no face at all. More sightings followed. Always fleeting, always in the periphery. This fifth child never moved normally. It appeared to lean forward as it walked, as though pulled by something just ahead. And wherever it lingered, plants grew in strange patterns, their stems bending toward Hollow Bend. One night, the O'Donnell family returned from a visit to find their home changed. The windows were where the doors should be. The staircase led down instead of up. The rooms connected in impossible ways, and yet all their belongings were in place. Afterward, Mr. O'Donnell was often seen standing in the street at dusk, staring toward the Bellroot property, whispering to himself. His wife stopped speaking altogether. Rumors spread that the fifth child lived in a part of the Bellroot house no one else could see. A backwards wing visible only in reflections. Some claimed they'd seen it in mirrors or in the still surface of the well water, beckoning silently. By summer, more houses began to turn wrong overnight. Doors opened into walls. Chimneys smoked though no fire burned. And in every case, the last person to be seen near the property was the faceless child. The invitation came in the form of a single line, scrawled on parchment and tacked to the door of the general store. You are welcome to witness the hollowing. No one knew who had posted it, but the handwriting had an unsettling curve, as though written by a hand unfamiliar with the letters. That night, a low vibration hummed through the town, rattling glass but leaving the air strangely still. Time began to bend. Lamplights flickered in unnatural rhythms. Shadows stretched in directions that made no sense. Several townsfolk awoke to find themselves in places they did not remember walking to. A woman claimed she had stood at her kitchen sink one moment and been in the Bellroot yard the next, with Alvara's pale face inches from hers. The Hollow Bend property seemed larger, the house taller, its roofline twisting like something alive. Windows opened where there had been walls. Doors shifted place when no one was looking. People's names began to slip from conversation entirely, as though the idea of them had been hollowed out. Mirrors reflected scenes that were not there. Fields of black snow, rivers running backward, strangers walking streets that were not Marrowfield. The Bellroots moved freely among the townsfolk that night, touching shoulders, murmuring to children, their words too soft to catch. Wherever they went, people stood still, eyes unfocused, as if waiting for something to arrive. The hollowing had begun. By the end of that first week, the Bellroot house no longer looked like any human dwelling. Its walls seemed to breathe in the cold night air, expanding and contracting in slow rhythm. The shingles shifted like scales on a living thing, catching moonlight at angles that shouldn't have existed. A narrow tower rose where the chimney had been. It grew higher each night, though no scaffolding or tools could be seen. The windows in this tower were not aligned, and when you tried to count them, the number changed. Inside, time fractured. Those who claimed to have entered spoke of hallways that doubled back on themselves, staircases that led down but ended in an upper floor. The air smelled faintly of iron, and mirrors covered entire walls, their surfaces spiderwebbed with cracks that shifted when no one touched them. The Bellroots had a strange command over these mirrors. Townsfolk reported seeing their own faces reflected back, altered, eyes too wide, mouths fixed in faint smiles they weren't making. Sometimes, the reflections moved after the person had already turned away. By day, Hollow Bend's land changed shape. Patches of earth lifted into low mounds, each marked by a circle of flat stones etched with curling symbols. Old fences warped into spirals. A barn nearby collapsed inward, its beams folding as neatly as paper. The Bellroots began speaking in riddles when approached, their words layered with meanings that never seemed to settle into clarity. Every place has another place beneath it, Tomlin told the blacksmith one morning. We are simply loosening the boards. And each night, the house pulsed brighter in the fog, its light leaking through the cracks in its walls like the heartbeat of something waiting to be born. The fog deepened, thick with the smell of wet stone. Then, one night, a sound rose from Hollow Bend, a low, slow drumbeat that carried through every street. From the eastern edge of town, figures began to emerge. They were veiled, their clothes hanging in tatters, their steps perfectly in sync with the drum's rhythm. No one recognized their faces, though some swore they felt a pang of familiarity, as if seeing an old friend in a dream. They passed through the town in silence, heading toward the Bellroot property. Their feet left no prints, but where they stepped, the ground seemed to darken, as if remembering something it had tried to forget. Behind them, faint carvings appeared in the dirt, shapes and symbols like those painted by the Bellroot twins on the dead trees. Within hours, the carvings hardened, becoming part of the ground itself. The procession lasted until dawn. By then, more than 100 figures had crossed into Hollow Bend and vanished behind the crooked house. No one saw them leave. Later, when brave souls dared to approach, they found the soil disturbed in wide spirals. Beneath the loosened earth, carved into the bedrock, were vast, interlocking patterns, lines and curves older than the town, older than the prairie. The forgotten had come home. After that night, the Bellroots no longer pretended to be like the rest of Marrowfield. Alvara moved through the streets at midday, her eyes black from corner to corner, her skin faintly translucent in the sunlight. The twins walked hand in hand, whispering into cupped palms and blowing whatever they held into the faces of passers-by. The recipients would stop, blink, and then smile faintly, as if something important had just been erased from their minds. The boy, Elier, began carrying a thick leather-bound ledger wherever he went. Townsfolk noticed that the ledger's pages contained names, hundreds of them, written in a script that shifted when you tried to read it. Some names were struck through with a deep, bleeding ink. Others glowed faintly in candlelight. One page was always left blank, except for a single line at the bottom. "The last name is yours." Shadows in Marrowfield no longer matched their owners. People reported catching sight of their own silhouettes moving in the distance while they themselves stood still. The air grew heavier, as if the entire town had sunk into deeper soil. At night, the fog glowed from within, lit by no source anyone could find. It was no longer about fear. The Bellroots had moved beyond that. What remained now was inevitability. It began with a split in the earth, right behind the Bellroot house. A jagged crack, black-veined and pulsing faintly like something alive. Each day the split widened. The edges crumbled away into darkness, though no sound of falling earth could be heard. The first to vanish was a stray dog that wandered too close. It didn't fall. It was pulled, as though the ground itself had reached up and taken it. Soon, people began disappearing the same way. A farmer, crossing his field at dawn, stepped on a patch of soil that gave way beneath him. He was gone before his wife could reach him. A group of men tried lowering a rope into the pit, but it was drawn in as if yanked by invisible hands. The crack spread in thin veins throughout the town. At night, they glowed faintly, casting strange shadows that stretched in impossible directions. No one could say how deep the pit went. The glow seemed endless, as though it led not downward, but elsewhere entirely. It happened in a single evening. The earth shuddered once, a long, deep groan like wood splintering under great weight. Buildings folded inward, not crumbling, but folding, bending into themselves until they were gone. The streets curled like paper in a fire, vanishing without ash. Only two things remained: the altar that had stood in the town square, and the Bellroot ledger now resting atop it. The Bellroot children circled the altar, each holding a shard of something pale and smooth, pieces of bone carved into spirals. They began to descend into the widening pit behind their home. As they went, their shapes blurred, becoming thin and stretched, until they resembled shadows more than bodies. And then they were gone. The wind returned to Marrowfield that night, carrying no scent, no sound. The place where the town had stood was now only grass and earth, as if nothing had ever been built there. But the ledger still lay open on the altar, its last page blank. Waiting. Beneath the pit was no cavern. It was a vast expanse of chambers and corridors, carved from stone that pulsed faintly like the inside of a living creature. The Bellroots moved easily through it, their footsteps soundless. The walls were lined with alcoves, and in each alcove sat an object. A lock of hair, a child's shoe, a cracked teacup, a folded letter. Every piece radiated a strange pull, as if it contained the weight of an entire life. This was the archive, a library not of books, but of grief. The air down there was heavy with memory. You could feel it pressing against your skin, whispering fragments of conversations you'd forgotten, showing flashes of moments you'd never lived. The Bellroot children moved among the alcoves, touching each object with reverence. When they reached the end of the great hall, Alvara produced the ledger. One by one, they wrote names in the remaining blank spaces. With each name added, an alcove sealed itself, the object inside turning to dust. When the final name was written, the earth above trembled. Somewhere far above, Marrowfield was erased. Not destroyed, but untethered from memory. By the time the Bellroots turned to leave, the archive had gone silent. No more whispers, no more pull. It was done. On the surface, the prairie stretched unbroken under the sky. No houses, no roads, no trace of Marrowfield. Travelers crossing the land sometimes felt a faint resistance in the air, like pushing through unseen water. Others described a pull in the chest, urging them toward a certain patch of tall grass. If they followed it, they might find a small dip in the land, a shallow basin where the wind moved differently. Some swore they heard faint laughter there, or the echo of footsteps pacing in a circle. No map marked Marrowfield anymore. In county records, the land was listed simply as unclaimed. But those who had lived there once, the ones who somehow survived the hollowing, carried gaps in their minds they couldn't explain. They dreamed of faces they couldn't name and streets they'd never walked, yet the dreams left them with a deep, aching loss. And at night, under certain moons, a faint light could be seen under the grass, moving slowly, as though something far below was still alive. It was 8 years later, in 1861 Virginia, when the pattern began again. A carriage arrived in Black Hollow just after dusk. Inside were 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, and a woman veiled in black lace. They spoke little, their accents strange, their eyes reflecting more light than they should. The woman introduced herself only as Aunt Mercy, and claimed they were kin to the late Witherstone family, inheritors of the abandoned manor on the hill. Few in town recalled the Witherstones. Those who did spoke of sudden deaths and locked rooms. The orphans moved into the manor immediately. Within days, townsfolk began noticing oddities. Lights in the windows at impossible hours, the sound of footsteps running across the roof, objects vanishing and reappearing in different homes. Animals avoided the road to the manor. The town's children whispered about the new arrivals. How the boy's shadow didn't match his movements. How the younger girl never blinked. How the older one's smile always seemed slightly too wide. And then came the first night when the manor's upper windows glowed red, and the sound of a slow, steady knocking echoed across Black Hollow. Attempts to approach the manor were met with confusion. Men sent to have a word with Aunt Mercy often returned unsure of why they had gone, or what they had said. Some swore they'd been gone an hour. Others insisted it had been days. Conversations in town began to falter mid-sentence. People lost track of what they were doing, standing still for long stretches as if listening to something far away. Objects began appearing in strange places. A teacup in the middle of the road, a rocking chair in the belfry, a child's shoe on every doorstep one morning. No one claimed them, and no one dared throw them away. Time grew slippery. Days seemed to loop. The same wagon passed down the street 3 times in one afternoon, its driver not appearing to notice. The manor itself seemed to breathe, its windows shifting shape, its doors changing places overnight. And in the foggy mornings, faint silhouettes could be seen moving along the roofline, too tall to be the orphans, too thin to be human. The town began to speak less. And then one day it simply stopped. It began with a cracked mirror in the dressmaker's shop. The crack widened on its own, curling into a spiral, and when the shopkeeper looked into it, she saw herself standing in the manor's hallway. More mirrors followed. In each one, townsfolk saw impossible scenes. Rooms they'd never been in, streets paved in black stone, the veiled woman beckoning from just beyond the frame. People began covering their mirrors, but it made no difference. Reflections appeared in puddles, in polished wood, in the shine of a spoon. The manor's windows gleamed brighter each night, until it became clear they were not reflecting the town at all, but another place entirely. Sometimes the faces in those panes pressed forward, mouths moving silently, hands reaching. Those who stared too long into any reflective surface began to forget small things. The color of their own eyes, their own names, where they had been standing a moment ago. The house was feeding on memory, on identity, and the mirrors were its mouth. The sound came just before dawn, a deep, metallic toll that rolled through Black Hollow like a slow wave. It was not the church bell. The tone was too heavy, too hollow, as if it had been struck deep underground. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, scanning the empty streets. The sound came again, and this time, some swore they felt it inside their bones, rattling their teeth. By midday, the source was found. A massive bell, half buried in the earth behind Witherstone Manor. Its surface was dark and pitted, but as the fog thinned, shapes became visible in the metal faces. Dozens of them, mouths open in silent cries, eyes wide and wet with a light that was not reflection. When the bell tolled a third time, those faces shifted, their lips forming words no one could hear. The orphans stood near it, motionless, eyes closed as if listening. Soon, townsfolk began unconsciously echoing the bell's tone. Not loudly, just a faint hum at the back of the throat, heard when they passed each other in the street. It became so common no one remarked on it. And yet, every time the bell tolled, something was missing. A memory, a detail, a face in a family photograph. It was as if the sound itself erased a small piece of the town each time it rang. It began at the far end of Black Hollow Cemetery. A groundskeeper swore he saw a hand emerge from the soil, not clawing, but simply resting on the grass, fingers twitching as if testing the air. By the next morning there were more. Fragments of the dead began appearing. An arm from one grave, a voice from another, the faint outline of a figure sitting on a headstone. They did not move far from their resting places, but they interacted with the living in unsettling ways. A whisper in the ear when no one stood nearby, the sensation of a hand resting on your shoulder, the sight of your grandmother's smile from behind a veil of fog. Soon, these fragments wandered into town. A man missing his lower half drifted through the market, waving politely. A pair of hands folded laundry at the inn. Voices of the long dead joined conversations in the tavern. The line between the living and the remembered blurred. No one spoke of the dead as gone anymore, they were simply present in a different way. And the orphans? They seemed delighted. They moved among the fragments, touching them gently, whispering as if greeting old friends. The first procession came on a moonless night. The bell tolled, and from the cemetery gates poured a steady stream of the remembered dead. They walked slowly through the streets, their forms flickering between whole and fragmented. One moment complete, the next only a pair of eyes floating in the air, or a mouth forming words with no sound. The living stepped aside for them, bowing their heads, as if by instinct. Some even joined the line, their bodies shifting with the same flickering instability, their faces taking on the pale glow of the remembered. At the front of the procession were the Witherstone orphans, their small feet bare against the cold ground, leading the way with the confidence of royalty. Behind them, Aunt Mercy walked, her veil stirring though there was no wind. The line wound through every street, visiting every home. Some families opened their doors, allowing the remembered inside, where they sat at tables, touched old belongings, and stared at the living with knowing eyes. By dawn, the procession had returned to the cemetery. But the living who had joined them did not return. It was gradual, almost gentle. The cemetery began to thin, not because graves were being emptied, but because they were no longer needed. The dead did not stay in their places. They wandered freely, mingling with the living until no distinction could be made. Illness no longer led to death, but to a slow transformation. A sick man might vanish from his bed for a night and return with a faint glow in his eyes, his voice carrying the hollow echo of the bell. Children grew, but their faces remained unchanged. Elders forgot the feel of their own age, moving as lightly as those decades younger. Time folded in on itself until no one could say how long they had lived in Black Hollow. The concept of death dissolved. People were not gone. They were simply remembered differently. Some walked in solid form, others flickered like candlelight, but all were present in the same streets, in the same houses. The Witherstone Manor stood at the center of it all, its windows always lit, its halls always whispering. The orphans watched from the porch, their faces serene, knowing that their work was complete. And in that strange, endless town, where no one truly died, the past and present were no longer separate things. They were one, and they belonged to the Witherstones.